Good evening, everyone. My name is Kaylee. I'm from the Guilford Public Library in Guilford, New Hampshire. And tonight we are having the program Granite Gallows, the origins of New Hampshire's debate over the death penalty with Christopher Benedetto. Benedetto?
Yep.
I forgot how to say it 2 seconds later.
No, you got it right the first time. Not many people do.
This is a New Hampshire Humanities program, and we are very grateful for their sponsorship of this program. Without them, we would not be able to have it. You'll find a survey in the link below. And if you have any questions, like I mentioned before, you can use the react emotion to raise your hand. You can wave to me. You can unmute yourself and ask if it's, if I, for some reason, don't see you, you can ask in the chat. Yeah, all right. And so, Chris, we'll let you introduce yourself now.
Great. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody. As I was telling Kaylee, my last time doing this talk was almost a year ago next week in Laconia. It's been a while, but it's always enjoyable, always a stimulating discussion, and it just made me think about how, insane, tragic, however you want to describe how the past year has been, and especially from a historian's perspective, it is amazing how cyclical these things are, and how we, despite studying history, don't always seem to learn from it. And I think the death penalty is another one of those kind of lightning rod issues. Still is in New Hampshire, which, we can talk about some of the more contemporary issues at the very end. But just a little bit more about me. I have some deep roots in New Hampshire, even though I didn't spend my childhood here. I grew up in Ipswich, Mass. But I had multiple family members that lived in the area. Traced my own family back on my mother's side, the Jones family, back to Deerfield. And I've returned home, so to speak. I've been living in New Hampshire for almost 20 years now. And amongst other things, have been teaching history at Granite State College for more than a decade. But my interest in this topic really began when I first moved to Portsmouth in 2004, when I came across description of the first executions in New Hampshire's history were actually in 1739. And I don't want to give away too much yet, but I was shocked as much by how little information there seemed to be at the time. I actually, one of the few accounts I could find was a book, The Annals of Portsmouth, which I think dates from like the 1830s. But really, there have been so very little academic or any research at all into this whole period of history. And you walk around Portsmouth and, there's so much history in Portsmouth. It's so much a fabric of that community. And yet there was virtually nothing to tell you that the death penalty or capital punishment had started in Portsmouth. And of course, this is, the same era when, the year before that, the African-American burial ground had just been discovered. It was still being, DNA research was still being done. This is 2004, so we're talking 16, 17 years ago. So the death penalty kind of took a back seat to that, but I decided that at that point, it was still on the books in New Hampshire, of course, although there were no pending cases at the time. Of course, today there is. So a lot has happened since I began researching. First, it became a few articles, and then I realized that this is something that deserves something much more lengthy than that. And other than a few articles in a few legal journals studying crime and punishment in New Hampshire, there was really nothing in the popular, I guess, history field to discuss it. So Granite Gallows, of course, is kind of a play on words. There was never such thing, but New Hampshire, I think, has always had this reputation of being kind of, granite, being strong. It implies kind of this old New England kind of foundation. And that often, as we'll see, became at times a source of conflict between, as they'll see over time, between we could say the faith-based or the spiritual part of the state, um, at times have switched sides on this issue. And of course, the issue at the heart of the death penalty as well is, does the state, does the government, have the right to take someone's life? And that has something that has constantly been, as we'll see, under attack or certainly under debate for not just a few decades, but in fact, for centuries here in New Hampshire. The photo I have there on the front page of my presentation is actually from Colonial Williamsburg, but a lot of times you see images, or everybody is probably familiar with the Salem witch trials of people climbed a ladder and were pushed off, as it was said, but it wasn't always that way. We know that there were some gallows that were actually built in Portsmouth prior to the first executions, but when it's unclear if those were actually used, but it does give you a sense of there were different, gruesome to say, techniques of executing someone. So we'll not look quite at that as much as the debate around the first executions and kind of how that ignited this debate that, of course, is still going on in New Hampshire today. So let's move on to the next slide. Thank you. So 24 individuals have been executed in New Hampshire's history, all but 3 of them during the 18th and 19th centuries. And as of this date, there has not been an execution in New Hampshire since 1939. So will there be a 25th? And that's a question that has not yet been decided. So we'll talk about that at the end of the presentation. And once again, this is an 18th century woodcut, or that would have been used as a print, which that's one of the other really kind of gruesome aspects of this history, is that the death penalty, even going back to the 18th century, became commercialized. And it was something that was almost like a public, I wouldn't call it a sporting event, but it had that kind of atmosphere where people would come from many miles away to witness an execution. And broadsides or posters, or even sometimes pamphlets discussing the last words or the whole case would be published at the event to be sold or afterwards. So this is one from Massachusetts from that era, but we'll look at a few contemporary images of executions in New Hampshire as well. So let's move to the next one. Next slide, please. Okay, so just for a little bit of context before we get into the actual cases here in New Hampshire. Colonial New Hampshire and Massachusetts, they were basically the same colony until the 1670s, and till New Hampshire received its own royal charter in 1679. And even after that, they followed essentially the same legal codes, which allowed the death penalty for many offenses in the 18th century and 17th century even. And we're talking about, you could be executed for rape, murder, of course, witchcraft, which is still the most fascinating one for a lot of people, and even for concealing the birth of an illegitimate child, which became a source of tremendous controversy even in the 18th century. And we'll see how the social norms of the time kind of evolved and changed after 1739. But before New Hampshire first resorted to the death penalty, Massachusetts had executed 137 people. And why was there such a discrepancy if they followed a lot of the same laws? Let's go to the next one. Next slide, please. So this is a really interesting question, and I don't think there's a firm answer for this. Of course, 19 people alone were executed during the Salem witch trials in a matter of a few months in 1692. But the vast majority of people in Massachusetts, for example, were not executed for witchcraft. It was for murder, concealing illegitimate children, rape, what have you. And I just started to wonder why. Why is there such a stark, difference in the two colonies? And let's just say it wasn't for a lack of trying. In my research in the court records of this era, between 1648 and 1738, there were at least 12 documented murders in New Hampshire, which could have resulted in the death penalty, but none of them did. Part of that is there wasn't enough evidence to convict. In the early 1700s, it was quite a infamous murder of a young woman in Portsmouth, and of course, sailors. Those rogues were among the prosecuted parties, but in none of these cases, which I guess is just coincidence, were they able to convict these people, which in one way, I guess, it's kind of reassuring fact that, they did follow the law and they weren't necessarily eager to execute people, which in Massachusetts, they really were overzealous about it. And there were also witchcraft cases in New Hampshire. The most well-known, outside of Goody Cole of Hampton, of course, is well known in that area today. There was quite a large witchcraft situation in Newcastle, which at the time was called Great Island. Today, it's the smallest town in New Hampshire. It's just outside of Portsmouth along the coast, making it one of the wealthiest today. But in the 1680s, it was quite a different community, very kind of hard scrabble, working class, sailors and fishermen and so on. And this is 10 years before Salem. That's what's interesting. And in this case, the main evidence were flying stones that were flying through the air. And in the end, though, they were never able to pin down who was responsible, or at least there wasn't any, as we know in the Salem case, that today is called spectral evidence, which was basically anyone could accuse someone of turning into a spirit or cavorting with the devil. And basically that was enough to convict people 10 years later in Salem. But in Newcastle, in New Hampshire, that didn't happen. And for anybody who's interested in this case, there's an excellent book by, of course it's coming up backwards, but it's by Emerson Baker or Tad Baker. It's called The Devil of Great Island. Came out about 10 years ago. But it's a fantastic exploration of the subtitles Witchcraft and Conflict in Early New England. And it's certainly one of the books I was reading as I was writing my own book. That, even though the first two people executed in New Hampshire were women, it was not for witchcraft. It was for an entirely different moral crime. So we'll get into that next, on the next slide. Thank you. So what was going on in New Hampshire? One way to kind of look at what the society is concerned about or preventing, or what may be going on that people feel the need to take action against, is by looking at the laws that are being passed. And in New Hampshire, it's quite interesting. They were very concerned, not as much about witchcraft as these moral crimes, especially women who conceived children out of wedlock and maybe their children passed away. And in 1714, the General Assembly at that time of the colony passed a law which declared, "Be it therefore enacted that if any woman be delivered of any issue of her body, male or female, and that she endeavor privately either by drowning or secret bearing thereof, so to conceal the death thereof, that it may not come to light, whether it were born alive or not, but be concealed. In every such case, the mother so offending shall suffer death, as in the case of murder, except such mother can make proof by one witness at the least. The child whose death was by her so intended to be concealed was born dead. So there's a lot of ambiguity in this law. Basically, a woman could be executed if she concealed, the death of a child after birth, and she had to have a witness to be able to show that the child was stillborn. And here was the catch that many of these women in New Hampshire that we'll see were caught on, is that by the illicit nature of some of these children, they did not have any witnesses, or didn't want any. And in this case, unfortunately, it cost some of these women their lives, which is really unfortunate. But it shows us what also the colonial elites of New Hampshire were focused on at the time. So we'll move on to the next slide. So here's a shocking headline. So imagine you're in New Hampshire, or for that matter, in Boston in 1739. That's because New Hampshire didn't have its own newspaper until 1756. So at the time, any printable news from New Hampshire was actually coming out of the Boston Gazette, which is what you see here. And this would have been quite a shocking headline or article to read for anybody along the coast of New England. And basically it describes, I'm not going to read verbatim, but I'll read the first sentence or two. Portsmouth in New Hampshire, August 17th. Last Saturday morning was found dead in a well here, a female infant lately born and supposed to be murdered, and warrants being issued to His Majesty's Justices of the Peace to search for the mother. Inquiry was made through the town by the officers who had the warrants. In the afternoon, a widow woman named Sarah Simpson, who had been suspected some time before to have been with child, was apprehended and charged with being the mother of the child found in the well, which she denied. But at the same time said she would go and show where she had buried her child, and accordingly went with the constable who apprehended her and dug up her child, as she said it was, being buried about 4 inches above the ground by the riverside. So this is a really shocking course of events that happened on that August day. And it raises a few interesting trends that we start to see across colonial America at that time. Mainly women giving birth to infants that are illegitimate. What do they do with these children? And unfortunately, this is something that we're going to see in the archaeological record as well in other parts of colonial America. A well is a convenient and quick place to dispose of a body, especially an infant's body. However, in this case, Sarah Simpson's saying that, no, I didn't drop my child in the well, I buried it by the river. So the problem is who is the mother of this other child? So what the article continues to tell us is that an Irish servant, who we'll learn more about in the next slide, is suspected to be the mother of the child found in the well. So let's go to the next slide, please. So this is just to give you a sense of Portsmouth in the 18th century. Really, if you're standing on the main side of the river today, the image of Portsmouth here really hasn't changed a heck of a lot. Yes, some of the buildings are larger, but the two churches you see are basically in the same spot. They're not the same buildings, but they're in the same location. And this was a watercolor done of Portsmouth around the early 1770s, but it had not changed very much between 1739 and 1770. And in fact, the churches that you see here are going to be important in this story, because to support kind of the civil law, the colonial society of New Hampshire invoked the clergy as well. They were kind of complicit in this in the kind of execution of the death penalty in that whole process. So that just gives you a sense of what the city looked at this point. Next slide. Okay, so the next shocking occurrence on August 18th, 1739 is that the next day, Penelope Kenny was her name. She was a native of Limerick, an early Irish immigrant that probably came over here as an indentured servant. And this is a good 100 years before the Great Migration of the Irish in the 19th century. She was interrogated by authorities who suspected her of being the mother of the baby found in the well. And according to the article on the previous page, she would not give direct answers to questions put to her. And only after spending a night in the local jail did she finally confess that she alone delivered of a male child alive the Wednesday morning before, and that she confessed she put it alive into a tub in her master's cellar and then left it till Friday night following, when she threw it into the river. So a really heinous crime from their perspective, but also we have to put our mindset also to these poor women who were under the gun. If they were found to be pregnant illegitimately in the society, they would of course be shunned and lose their position. And that's why they're having to hide these pregnancies. But on the other hand, by doing so, they virtually sign their own death warrants under the law at that time. Let's go to the next slide. Both of these women, I've tried to do as much research as I can. It's mentioned that Sarah Simpson was a widow, but I have not been able to determine who her husband was. It's possible he had died somewhere else or had perhaps been a sailor. We don't know. Kenny was a 20-year-old Irish immigrant, which is an interesting connection she's going to have with one of the ministers in Portsmouth, who actually, in fact, was also Irish, that we'll learn about shortly. But of course, the jury is made up of all men at the time. And they were both convicted of feloniously concealing the death of an infant bastard child on August 30th, 1739. So we're only talking a couple weeks later. These trials move very, very quickly, unlike, capital trials today take years often. And according to one official, the trials of Simpson and Kenny were long, tedious, and attended with much trouble and difficulty. And over 30 witnesses were summoned to testify. There was some uncertainty, though, about the crimes that these women committed. And Jabez Fitch was one of the ministers in Portsmouth, and he wrote quite an extensive description of the events that really is one of the most valuable resources for historians today. And it was published at the end of his sermon about these crimes. And he wrote that Simpson and Kennedy both denied that they laid violent hands on their children, one affirming that her child was dead born, and the other that hers died soon after it was born. But for Fitch, these claims were irrelevant because both seemed sensible of the neglect of taking due care to preserve the life of their children, so that they thought themselves guilty of the breach of the sixth commandment by omission, if not by commission. All right, so next slide. Both women were sentenced to be hanged on November 21st, 1739. However, this is really a shocking course of events that, two women were about to become the first people ever executed in New Hampshire. And they were aware of the gravity of that. And Simpson and Kenny were persuaded by, according to Fitch, some indiscreet persons who came to visit them, that their sentence was rigorous and unjust, that they might obtain a reprieve so as to be finally executed from suffering. So clearly there were people in the community who did not agree with this death sentence. And we don't know who they were, but they clearly went to these women and wanted them to petition to the governor. At the time, In fact, New Hampshire and Massachusetts had the same governor at that point. So what that tells me is that the people then understood that this is really unprecedented, that maybe this didn't have to happen. And as we'll see later in my presentation, especially as we get into the 19th century, the subject of women on death row, as we would call it now, became even more controversial for the same crime. But as we'll see, our attitudes in New Hampshire, of course, across America, about women and crime began to change. So a petition was sent to Jonathan Belcher, the governor. November 12th, he signed an order that postponed the executions until the end of December. Next slide, please. The Day of Reckoning. So even though we hadn't seen it before in New Hampshire, there was quite a customary process for these executions that would happen. Both, the condemned person or persons would be led to their final church meeting, where there would be a sermon by the minister, and these became known as the execution sermon. And of course, they always took, the opportunity to scare the bejesus out of everyone else in the community not to do the same thing. But this was a different situation. It had never happened before in New Hampshire. Everybody was really, taken by the gravity of it, and the fact that it was two young women too. That seems to have affected even the ministers themselves. So Penelope Kenny, she spent her dwindling hours at Queen's Chapel, which is on, if you know Portsmouth at all, the site of it today is there's a church at the top of Bow Street in Portsmouth, which is downtown. It's kind of the church that sits up on the hill. It's a brick church today because the church that where this actually took place burned down in 1810, but it's on the same site. And Arthur Brown, who was the minister there, this was an Episcopal church. He was also a native of Ireland, and he had served as the rector of King's Chapel, which was in Providence, Rhode Island, before moving to Portsmouth in 1736, so about 3 years earlier. And he's a fairly prominent minister in not just New Hampshire, but New England at this point. If we go to the next slide, this is actually a picture of him about almost 20 years later by John Singleton Copley. Obviously very famous portraitist in American 18th century art. And this is owned by Historic Deerfield today. You can see the original painting. But certainly he probably wouldn't have looked much different than this. Obviously a little bit less portly, but would have had very similar garb on that December day in 1739. So let's move to the next slide. So these are a couple. The image on the left is of Queen's Chapel, as it probably would have appeared in the 18th century from the water. And then we also have the Mcfedris Warner House, which is one of the most important 18th century houses in New Hampshire. It was the first brick home built in New Hampshire. It's also famous for the lightning rod, which you can actually see on the side of the chimney there that Ben Franklin installed himself, of course, many, many years later. But this house is at the bottom of the hill, where the church at Penelope Kenny went to in the morning of her death. And we can only but imagine that she most definitely would have walked by this building on the way to her execution. So I always go by that building and think about, what it's witnessed. It's also very famous for inside our murals that were painted on the walls in the early 18th century that are incredible visual documents of this era. And if you haven't had a chance to visit the house, I'm not sure they were open last summer, but hopefully they will be this year. So the next slide, please. So both of these sermons to each of these condemned women were published afterwards, and they're really interesting, important documents today. If you want to get an insight into what people were thinking back then. And I'll just read you a few selections here. May her untimely end influence you all, warned Arthur Brown. To lay fast hold on instruction, may her example and sufferings answer the intention of law, and deter all viciously and wickedly disposed persons among you from incurring the like condemnation. But just as the ministers portrayed Penelope Kenny and Sarah Simpson as criminals destined for eternal damnation, they also represented the young women as pitiful sinners who were eager to repent. Arthur Brown asked his audience, "Why should I at present upbraid or insult this poor malefactor? She is convinced, I trust, of the heinousness of her sins, and may her preparation and repentance avail her in the day of the Lord." So some really interesting language. He's using her to kind of, obviously, as an example for this is not how you behave. But on the other hand, he clearly had sympathy for this young woman who was also from Ireland like him. And I can only but imagine that must have been a comfort to her, during her last days. Okay, next slide, please. All right. I was able to do some research, and I was able to discover that it had snowed. From the Boston Gazette, they would often list the weather during the week. You would have multiple issues each week of this newspaper. So clearly it was a cold winter day. Fresh blanket of snow had shrouded the landscape. But we know, I went looking for contemporary accounts, not just from the ministers, but were there any other people that might have witnessed this event that left a record? And we know the execution drew together a vast concourse of people, probably several thousand. And the numerous spectators seemed earnestly concerned for them, which was really interesting. You get a sense, even though these laws have been in the books for years, that no one in New Hampshire had seen anything like this before, and they definitely garnered a lot of sympathy. And in the crowd was Samuel Lane, who today has a pretty famous diary from early colonial New Hampshire. And all he wrote was he traveled to see two women hanged at the bank. It's a fairly terse entry. I was hoping he would have given us some more thoughts about what he thought, but we don't have that. However, we do have, eyewitness accounts from the ministers who clearly, I think impacted themselves by what they witnessed that day. And by the time Simpson approached her final moments, Jabez Fitch remarked that she had discovered an uncommon composure of mind, and that gave very pertinent answers to the questions that were put to her. Really interesting description. I think about it a lot of what these women went through, and the fact that she had discovered an uncommon composure of mind. It's just really it gives you some human insight into these people, that they weren't just in a document. It really gave me an insight, ironically, into what they were thinking, not these ministers. So I'm grateful to him that he was able to put that down for posterity. Let's go to the next slide. But after these executions had happened, and today to my knowledge, we've never discovered where they're buried. Most executions, people were buried in an unmarked grave. We know that happened after Salem. And to this day, I don't know of any examples of people finding, coming across a skeleton out in Portsmouth. Often, people executed were buried under a road. And that goes back to even an earlier English custom of people who were executed or committed suicide were believed to, be in purgatory, have a restless soul, and they were often buried under roads because that was believed that would keep their spirit from wandering. And there's actually examples of that even later than this in colonial New England. About 30 years ago, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who was she was a professor at UNH at the time, but then moved on to Harvard, became even more well-known. She came up with a very famous quote, which I think applies to this story. Well-behaved women seldom make history. But she wrote a Pulitzer Prize-winning book about a midwife in Maine, Martha Ballard. And Martha Ballard was writing in the very late 18th century, early 19th century, yet she also witnessed executions. And she also described how one person who unfortunately killed his family and also killed himself in 1809, his body was actually buried outside the cemetery in the road. So this is almost 100 years later that practice was still being put into use. So the mystery of where those two women are buried is still out there. There's another mystery, though, is that Penelope Kenny denied that child found in the well was hers. Do we believe her? Who knows? The fact is that there was still potentially somebody out there, because we know Kenny said she threw her baby in the river. So there was a third woman out there. And William Shirtliff, who was the other minister, preached to Sarah Simpson's execution. He wrote that there has been one among us through whose means these persons have been remarkably detected, and that is equally, and it may be more heinously guilty in the sight of God, that I could suppose the person to be within hearing. I would say, don't encourage yourself from your present impunity. Be assured that though you are as yet concealed from men, both you and your crime are known to God. Pretty threatening words. You wonder who was listening. All we know is that the identity of that third mother was never uncovered. And it's still unsolved to this day. Let's go to the next slide, please. Next slide when you're ready. Thank you. So this issue of women concealing the birth of children continued to be a problem in New Hampshire. As we get into the late 18th century, we have the famous case of Ruth Blay. And I suspect if anybody has heard of anybody executed in New Hampshire, it's probably her. She was a very similar case. And in a lot of ways, the first executions in 1739 really laid the legal precedent for the Ruth Blay case. So in a nutshell, for those of you who aren't familiar, 1768, she was a 25-year-old school teacher who was found to have given birth to a premature daughter under a barn in Hampton. And she was hanged on the outskirts of Portsmouth on December 31st, 1768. And in this case, we know that there was a lot of public dissent and controversy over her case. In 1739, we still have, it's kind of the end of the Puritan era. The laws were still fairly strict. By 1768, right, many things had changed in America. We had a colony that was far more in uproar against royal authority. And we get a sense that this became a lightning rod issue at the time. A local man named Samuel Hall, who was a farmer, sent a petition to the provincial assembly seeking compensation for damage done to his property. He complained of a new fence and stone wall that had to be erected, which was almost broke to pieces and thrown down by the crowd of people who attended the execution. Was it a riot? It sounds like it might have been. There's also a myth about Ruth Blay that her execution was delayed or postponed at the last minute, but that she had been hanged by the time that news arrived. Subsequent research has determined that that never happened. But this evidence clearly shows that people were not happy about this execution of a young woman. And it was to be the last one in New Hampshire, in fact, because of that. So we'll move on to the next slide. This is the area in the current cemetery today in Portsmouth where people believe she was hanged. There's also a lot of evidence, if you believe in that sort of thing, of her ghost roaming the cemetery, which has been very popular. Roxy's Wicker is a pretty well-known, paranormal specialist in New Hampshire, and has, done a lot of great work. I don't delve into ghost hunting, but if they did exist, if there was ever a reason for ghosts to exist, because of some injustice, I definitely think Ruth Blay would be one of those people. So we'll move on to the next slide. To me, what's more interesting than ghosts is how these events really change social norms and change the laws themselves. So the events of 1739, 1768 didn't mean that every woman accused of infanticide or concealing the death of an illegitimate child would be sent to her death. In fact, the evidence starts to show the opposite. After the American Revolution, there was another series of suspicious infant deaths in Portsmouth. 1786, the New Hampshire Spy, which was a later newspaper published here, reported that the body of a male infant was found with strokes or marks on its head. The child's mother was accused of committing the crime. However, the married woman's identity was mercifully guarded by local newspapers because the printers sought to use the greatest tenderness. We desire not to wound the feelings of the unfortunate by exaggerating every little particular. And this is perhaps because the woman was social status was higher. These younger women earlier on were not married and therefore subject to more social, ostracization. A married woman had more status and therefore had more of a motive, in fact, to conceal a birth. Then in May 1790, Dorothy Goss was charged with murdering her infant child, but she was found not guilty. Next slide, please. So, although deliberately violence was, in these cases, was evident, why did none of them result in capital punishment after the American Revolution? In Martha Ballard's diary, which I highly encourage anybody interested in this time period, the book is called A Midwife's Tale by Martha Ballard. By the end of the 18th century, what her diary also starts to show is that prevailing attitudes towards sexuality and capital punishment become more lenient. Social historians have demonstrated that after the revolution in New England, the number of women who conceived out of wedlock increased dramatically as the prosecution of this moral crime decreased. And in 1791, this subtle change in social norms was reflected by the repeal of the archaic statute, where that led to the first executions in New Hampshire in 1739. So lawmakers replaced the capital punishment with a form of symbolic execution, in which the mother so offending would be compelled to stand on the gallows for 1 hour with a noose around her neck, which is still pretty harrowing, but not suffer death. And one of the interesting things, too, we see in the archaeological record that I found in my research is Portsmouth is not the only city where women were disposing of children into wells. In the 1970s, when the neighborhood around Independence Hall was being excavated and prepared for the bicentennial, archaeologists found, mixed in with animal bones at the bottom of a privy, or in well, infant bones, multiple infants in Philadelphia that have been thrown down this privy or well over probably a few decades. And people began to realize that this is something that was happening across colonial America. However, in the following century, the 19th century, New Hampshire lawmakers would be compelled to reconsider whether women deserve to stand on the gallows once again. Let's go to our next slide. So before we move on to the 19th century, I do want to share the story of another pretty controversial execution that happened in 18th century New Hampshire that's in my book. It involves a man named Elijah Thomas. He was a Revolutionary War veteran, and he had actually been wounded during the war. He was one of the first, we could say, disabled American veterans in our history. It was actually granted a pension after the war. And because his gun had actually exploded in his hand, it had misfired, and he was left unable to perform manual labor. So after the war, one of his jobs was collecting taxes, which obviously made him not always the most popular guy in town. And he evidently also became an alcoholic. He was involved in a barroom brawl in New Durham, up off Route 11 today, and accidentally stabbed one of his own companions, Peter Brown, who's also a veteran of the war. And he became the first person to be executed in New Hampshire as a state after the American Revolution. And he was executed in downtown Dover. Today, ironically, it's the site of Henry Law Park, where there's a playground, and they have a festival every year. And I find that a little bit sardonic. And unfortunately, he just missed seeing the Constitution ratified when New Hampshire became the 9th state, as we're known today. So move on to the next slide. This is actually the only contemporary image of an execution in New Hampshire in the 18th century, depicting his coffin in the cart, which he would have rode in, and then they transported his body up to Pine Hill Cemetery, which is just up the street. And the church on the hill there is the first church in Dover, which is still there. It's a newer building, but on the same site. So this is a really important image because it's really the only contemporary one we have from New Hampshire of an execution during this era. So, all right, next slide. And this is his gravestone. Obviously, it wasn't erected in the 1700s. This was actually placed by the Daughters of the American Revolution in the 1930s. And when I had taken this picture years ago, unfortunately, the stone had been damaged, but since then it has actually been repaired. So you can go to Pine Hill Cemetery in Dover, which is pretty well known, a lot of historic grave sites there, and you can see this one. So, okay, next slide. So as we get into the 19th century, the death penalty starts to become much more controversial. And unlike the 18th century, when you had ministers who were providing kind of the spiritual component to these executions, the clergy actually start to question the state's or the government's right or power to execute people. And it really starts this modern debate that is still going on today in America, and was very central to the debate over the New Hampshire death penalty in the last few years. One of the most prominent and outspoken ministers in New Hampshire against the death penalty was Arthur Caverno of Great Falls, which is now Somersworth. And he wrote a sermon in 1835. It was, really, you can read it today, and it is one of the most powerful documents or arguments against the death penalty I have ever read.
Will it be said that although it is true that as God gave life, he alone had the right to take it, yet he has a right, if he please, to delegate the authority contended for by the advocates of capital punishment? But the question is, has God delegated it to us? Are not the legislator, the judge, the jury, the executioner, and even the assenting spectator all like the guilty? How Inquisition for blood? It's a really powerful statement at that time. He was one of the first people in New Hampshire to do it. Next slide, please. Ready for the next slide. Thank you. 2 years later, in 1837, there was a vote to abolish the death penalty failed. New Hampshire law classified first-degree murder, robbery, as virtually the only crimes in New Hampshire were now mandated to take place inside the walls of a prison in the county where the crime occurred. So they're trying to get away from this kind of circus-like atmosphere, which you see people congregating and kind of watching it. They really tried to make it a much smaller, kind of less public event. All right, next slide. And during the 1840s, the debate over the death penalty in New Hampshire continued to heat up. In 1843, the Nashua Gazette asked, "When will the principle of humanity become awakened in our legislators' bosoms? When will this brutal, savage thirst for human gore cease?" And the state's legislature ultimately decided to let the voters of New Hampshire decide this question. In November 1844, a hotly debated referendum to abolish the death penalty in New Hampshire was defeated by over 10,000 votes. The fact that there was even a referendum says something, that there were quite a vocal community of people. And in some ways, I wish there'd been a referendum about it more recently, which that was not how it was decided 2 years ago. So. And then only a few years later, New Hampshire authorities would be forced to decide whether a woman should receive the death penalty in the Granite State for the first time in nearly a century. Next slide, please. So, capital crimes. So in 1849, Letitia Blaisdell of New Boston was convicted of first-degree murder, and she was sentenced to hang for the poisoning of Benjamin Blaisdell, the 2-year-old son of her adoptive family. She had in fact tried to unsuccessfully poison the entire family with morphine, which in those days you could go to an apothecary or a drugstore and buy laudanum, which was a liquid form of opium, or morphine, which obviously in certain doses could be lethal. Through Franklin Pierce, soon to be president, was one of her lawyers at the time. He advised her to plead guilty, and she was sentenced to hang in August 1849. And over the following months, the possibility of the first woman in 90 years would be hanged in New Hampshire became real. And the debate over whether this execution should go forward became very heated. Right, next slide. So when a petition to commute her sentence reached the state legislature, it was hotly debated. Walter Harriman, who would eventually become a Civil War hero and governor of New Hampshire in the 1860s, argued that except for self-defense, I deny that the individual society has the right to take life. God gave, let him alone take away. I predict the day is not far distant when choking criminals to death, according to the law, will be unknown in New Hampshire. In the end, Blaisdell's death sentence was changed to life in prison by the state government. She was pardoned by Governor Goodwin in 1861. And we don't know what happened to her after that. But she did spend about 10 years in prison. And this raised the interesting issue of, in New Hampshire at that time, of female prisoners, which has been an issue in New Hampshire almost continuously. Because up until the last, I want to say, 15, 20 years, You know, the conditions for women prisoners in New Hampshire was very sketchy. And at this time, in fact, she lived, even though she was on death row, she lived with the warden of the prison because there was nowhere else for her to be that was safe. And it just shows you the predicament they were in of, you know, protecting this young woman for the male population of the prison, yet at the same time, you know, she was being executed for murder, you know, pretty cold, premeditated murder. So it just shows you the kind of the moral predicament they found themselves in. So, all right, next slide. So another case in New Hampshire soon after this one would kind of challenge the laws and the social norms as well. In 1851, the Farmer's Cabinet, which was a very prominent newspaper out of Amherst. Today, it's a museum. You can actually visit where they printed the paper for a long, long time in Amherst. A young woman named Kate Poole had arrived in Nashua with a disturbing tale to tell. She had claimed that while riding on the train from Manchester, her husband had thrown their infant daughter, Marion, out of the window and then threatened her with instant death if she raised the alarm. A search was immediately made for the child, which was found until the next day when it was taken up with its skull broken about a mile below Manchester. Suspicion was instantly raised that she was the murderer of the child. She was accordingly, because this husband of hers could not be found, and she was taken to Manchester for questioning. So next slide. And according to the newspaper articles of the time, quote, she remarked to someone that she had not the slightest remembrance of lifting the child up to throw it out of the cars, but that she should never forget seeing it fly through the air. It seemed to go like a feather. As soon as she saw that her babe was gone, she screamed, "Oh God, what have I done?" So loud that she supposed that they might be heard in the cars, being the ladies' saloon, and immediately left the saloon and went into the passenger car and sat down and wept. It seems that she had made several trials to obtain a place of work for her board the coming winter, but did not succeed. It says that she thought all were against her and that she had no friends. Taking all the circumstances into view, we must look upon it more as a case of desperation than a deliberate intention. So here was a very similar situation to the women we've studied from the 18th century. You know, become pregnant illegitimately because of the social norms. She really had nowhere to go, and found herself in this kind of impossible situation. So let's move to the next slide. The Manchester Mirror, on the other hand, sympathized with her. Who but a mother can imagine that woman's desperate feelings? What mother but one driven to distraction could be brought to the commission of such an act? But another publication, the Manchester American, was less empathetic. The citizens of Manchester have had in their day their full share of crimes and excitements. Within a few days, our city has been made the theater of an unheard of transaction, one that causes the blood to chill in the veins and the inquiry to rise of what is human nature capable. Next slide. So what happened to Kate Poole? In April of 1852, at the age of 23, she was spared the death penalty and sentenced to spend the rest of her life in the New Hampshire State Prison, with an additional punishment of 20 days of solitary confinement, which is pretty harsh in those days. But many members of New Hampshire's legislature thought her sentence too harsh. Ultimately, Governor Samuel Dinsmore succumbed to growing political pressure, pardoned Kate Poole in August 1852, after she had only spent a few months incarcerated in more comfortable quarters for female inmates. Next slide, please. So the circumstances which had saved the lives of Letitia Blaisdell and Kate Poole clearly mirrored a paradigm shift in the attitudes concerning capital punishment in New Hampshire between the mid-18th and 19th centuries. In the 20th century, another shift in public opinion would occur that would change the debate forever. The growing movement within the New Hampshire spiritual community would be a major role in this process, just as they had been since the very beginning. The next slide. Since 1900, the crimes it's covered have been modified for the death penalty in New Hampshire until, finally there were very few crimes that could be given the death penalty. 1937, murder during a kidnapping was added 5 years after the Charles Lindbergh kidnapping case, which was notorious at that time. In 1939, pedophile Howard Long was the last to die by hanging in New Hampshire after he murdered a young boy. And after that, there were no executions in New Hampshire for decades and decades. So if we go to the next slide, please. But as we start to get into the mid-20th century, we start to see national developments impacting what's going on in New Hampshire as well. In 1972, a Supreme Court decision derailed the whole death penalty in the United States briefly. Furman versus Georgia, a 5-4 decision, invalidated all death penalty statutes across the United States. However, a second decision in 1976, Gregg versus Georgia, lifted the ban, but advised states to adopt stronger review criteria. In New Hampshire, the decisions made their mark. By 1977, the legislature had amended the death penalty to be optional for capital crimes, not mandatory. By this point, too, really the only crime capital, for capital punishment was murder of a police officer. In 2000, Governor Gene Shaheen, senator, of course, vetoed a bill that would have abolished capital punishment. Clearly, this was an issue more complex in party lines, of course, because she's a Democrat. And that really, you start to see politics not to enter in so much of it as, what people's feelings are morally, ethically in this debate. So let's go to the next slide. What's interesting to me is how, even in the 18th century, what a important role the clergy played in these events. That was going to become the deciding factor as well, in my opinion, in the decision over the death penalty in New Hampshire. So in the 1990s, you had the New Hampshire Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty. Was founded as a project of the New Hampshire Council of Churches. When Bishop Douglas Thuner, the 8th Bishop of New Hampshire, was president. 2010, the 210th Convention of the Diocese of New Hampshire passed a resolution calling Episcopalians in the state to urge the governor and state representatives to repeal the death penalty statute in New Hampshire. This resolution had 19 named supporters, including the bishop. In 2012, the support of then Bishop Gene Robinson, the Diocesan Council voted to become a partner within the New Hampshire Coalition to abolish the death penalty. Their position stated that the death penalty is a failed public policy. Policy is arbitrarily applied, reflects racial and class bias, costs millions of dollars per case, and may traumatize murder victim family members, delay their healing, and runs the risk of executing innocent persons. Next slide. So this issue was going to become, it was really a mute issue until 2006. That's when everything changed, of course. In fact, I was on my honeymoon at this point. I was still researching my book. And of course, New Hampshire still had the death penalty, but no one had been executed since 1939. In fact, there was no facility in New Hampshire for an execution. And actually, there still isn't. But that, of course, all changed October of 2006, when Michael Addison shot police officer Michael Briggs, responding to a domestic violence call in Manchester. And he became, 2 years later, 2008, the first man more than 60 years in New Hampshire to receive death penalty sentence. And this, of course, set this debate, on a whole new angle. 2011, lawmakers voted to include home invasions as punishable by the death penalty after the brutal murder of Kimberly Cates in Mount Vernon. For those of you not familiar, it was a group of teenagers who just came up with this horrific plot and murdered her in her own home. In 2014, a measure to abolish the death penalty failed by a deadlock vote. However, in the next 4 years, opinions began to shift. 2018, only the veto of Governor John Sununu prevented the end of capital punishment in New Hampshire. So let's go to the next slide. So this debate was not over, clearly. Clearly, there was a very, how would I say, close vote on this. So the House of Representatives met again in 2019. They sought to repeal the death penalty by a 279 to 88 vote. New Hampshire Senate voted 17-6 in favor of the House Bill 455 to repeal the state's death penalty. On April 11th, statement issued by the governor's office said, Governor Sununu continues to stand with crime victims, members of the law enforcement community, and advocates for justice in opposing repeal of the death penalty. What we see here is the New Hampshire Coalition, as well as the Catholic Mobilizing Network, they took an opposing view. They celebrated this encouraging progress and look forward to the day when the state officially unshackles itself from the death penalty for once and for all. Next slide. And this is just a great image from that day, that vote. I think it was April 11th, 2019. For a lot of people, this became about their faith and about what they truly believed in, not about the law itself, which is interesting, I think. Okay, next slide. So on May 2nd, 2019, Governor Sununu vetoed the bill. He said, I firmly see along many folks across the state that this bill is an injustice, not just to Officer Briggs and his family, but to law enforcement and other victims of violent crime across the state. On May 30th, 2019, the New Hampshire Senate override the veto, and the repeal bid succeeds. New Hampshire became the 21st state to abolish the death penalty. The debate that began, it's now 282 years ago, in 1739 is over. But is it really? Next slide. So here's the interesting part of this debate that is not decided yet. The repeal bill that passed in 2019, it's not retroactive. Michael Addison is still on death row. The last time there was a hearing on this, is to my knowledge, in the state offices or state courts was 2019, November of 2019, that I could find. And I think probably there hasn't been much movement on this, of course, since then because of coronavirus. Appeals have reached the New Hampshire Supreme Court in his case, and probably might go higher than that. In one of the examples that's now going to be used by the defense for Michael Addison is in 2012, Connecticut had a similar repeal bill that passed, but it was also not retroactive. And at that point, they had somebody on death row. However, the state Supreme Court ruled that it was now unconstitutional for the state of Connecticut to execute that person, and their sentence was commuted to life. If that will happen in New Hampshire, we don't know. And that's why there's been a lot of debate about this next appointment to the New Hampshire Supreme Court, because many people believe he might be a deciding vote in that debate as well. So, we don't know if or when this execution will happen. As I've said, there is no current facility in New Hampshire to do an execution. So there's been a lot of discussion about it might happen in another state that has the facilities to do it, which of course raises a whole lot of other issues. And since Michael Briggs was unfortunately shot and this whole situation has developed, the whole debate over the death penalty in the United States has shifted quite a lot. Since 1978, more than 7,800 people have been sentenced to death. Close to 1,500 people have been executed or more. Of course, more of those have happened more recently. And after California's 2019 moratorium of the death penalty, there's still about 2,000 people on death row in the United States. We've also seen too that there's been a lot of issues with the humaneness of execution, especially with lethal injection. A lot of states, and we've seen the past few years, have been rushing executions through because the drugs that they're using are about to expire. In a lot of cases, they're not even being made anymore. So how this execution would happen is really very much unresolved. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. So, next slide. So by no means do I, in my lectures, try to enforce one view or the other. I really want people to see the history of the death penalty here in New Hampshire, and hopefully that will inform and illuminate your own feelings about the topic. If you're interested in this kind of history, I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, but if you're here tonight, maybe it is. My book, Granite Gallows, is available on Amazon. I go into a lot more about the cases that you heard about tonight, but additional ones that also raise a lot of interesting questions in New Hampshire history. And, you know, other kind of interesting topics such as grave robbing, which was quite a controversial topic in the day and still can be at times. So I encourage you to read further if you're interested. And I want to thank everybody for joining me tonight. I hope it was a informative talk, and I look forward to answering as best I can any questions you might have.
If you have a question, you can unmute yourself.
Oh,
I have a question.
sure.
I'm having a hard time understanding, or maybe you can't, maybe you don't understand either, how in the 1800s, the powers that be went from one extreme to the other with the two women that were pardoned. Letitia, yeah, you know, and it brings to mind something that I discovered in genealogy this year. A relative of mine in New York.
Okay.
A similar story, actually. We, my sister discovered that our great uncle married a widow who it ends up, she had murdered her two children in the late 1800s, and was found to, she tried to take her own life. And her husband at the time discovered this and took pity on her, and was very upset that she almost died from her own infliction, you know, but the children were dead. She went to a sanitarium for a couple of years and then was let out. And it's like, and then my great uncle married her, and I was horrified, and I gave up on genealogy for a couple months. I was so turned off by this story. How
it's incredible.
I know, it's like it seems like
you should write a book about that.
I know, I was horrified by it. I still am.
Yeah.
And it's a long story, but just
so. Do you know when this was? You said the late 1800s in New York.
Yeah, 18. I could give you the information if you want to find out.
Yeah.
Right there on Ancestry. Her name is Ada King Kelso, Kelso.
Ada King Kelso. Okay.
Kelso, and father's name was George, I think.
Because I'm sure she was in the news.
Yeah, you can find it on the you know, newspaper.
Yeah, you know, that's a huge question of why women were suddenly spared. I think it delves much deeper into the place of women in Victorian society. And at that time, you know, women had become, you know, it goes back to the title of one of the books I read in college, which is, you know, suffer, be silent and still. And on the other hand, women, you know, they were expected to be in the home, to be that kind of model of domestic virtue. Another term from that era is the model of womanhood, right? Women were kind of placed on this pedestal. They were supposed to behave a certain way. They were seen kind of to be free from the sins and the corruption that men were, or at least were supposed to be, right? They weren't always in reality. But I think that change in social status, to me, is one of the reasons why they started to look at, hey, we're saying, this woman committed this horrible, horrific crime, but on the other hand, we're saying that women are, special in our society, that they're, supposed to be on a different level than men. Even though obviously they were also placed in, these positions where they were expected to behave and act a certain way. And if they didn't, they were treated terribly. And it's one of these ironies I look at too in my courses. I'm teaching modern American history right now since 1865. And we look at, women are on one hand placed on kind of a pedestal socially. They're supposed to be free from sin and and so on. But on the other hand, they're told that they're not intelligent enough to vote. And you look at what women had to go through to get the vote 100 years ago. They were being beaten in the streets and by police officers. When Alice Paul in 1916 was being, force fed because she was starving herself in prison. You look at the brutality of what it was actually going on. It's far different than kind of the social stereotypes that existed. But I look at that as one of the reasons why they couldn't reconcile that women were supposed to be kind of on the social pedestal, and then at the same time justify executing a woman.
Yeah, and I'm not even talking about execution. I'm saying, why did they even let them out of prison or
that's a good question.
Holding them accountable.
Yeah.
Pardoning them is what?
I think it's for the same reasons.
Yeah.
They had done their time, or it's a great point, and I'm not sure there's a really good answer for that.
Maybe it's like, the guilt is punishment enough.
Yeah.
Not necessarily. I don't know.
True. And that's why I'm as curious about what happened to these women afterwards, because they were scorned. They had, obviously committed this horrific crime. And yet, if they went somewhere else, would anyone know that? They could change their name and no one would ever know their past. So it's interesting. And the whole question over, the controversy over the executions of capital punishment in the 19th century is interesting too, because you get into this era when, they start using the electric chair, and Thomas Edison was very heavily involved in this. And there was a huge debate over whether, the AC/DC debate, and I'm not talking about the band, I'm talking about, Edison had his source of electricity, and then you had Westinghouse. And there was, in fact, this incident where, to demonstrate the power or what was wrong with the electricity, Edison held a demonstration, or basically, he was invited where they first used the electric chair was actually in New York State. And it was horrific. The guy had smoke coming out of his ears. And, that's really when you start to get the modern movement against the death penalty, is people seeing those kind of executions. So obviously putting a woman in that situation in the 19th century or the early 20th century was just something they couldn't face. And I think that's probably why they kind of let her off the hook, because it just would have been such a horrific spectacle.
They oversteered, I think. I wonder.
Yeah, but that sounds like an absolutely fascinating case. What was her name again? Ada
King. That was her maiden name. Kelso.
Kelso
was her first married name, and then then it was Stearns. She married Guy Stearns.
Oh, your ancestor.
Yeah, he was a doctor in New York. Yeah,
that's interesting too. So she obviously had children with him later on in life.
She did not have children with him.
Oh, she did not. Okay.
No.
So you're descended from
He's my great uncle.
Oh, uncle, that's right.
His brother is my ancestor.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. I mean, I put it up to, like I said, the social norms around women changed and the society can no longer reconcile.
I don't mean to dominate. Others might have questions too. Thank
Yeah,
you.
no, great. Thank you.
Yep.
Anybody else? I thought I saw somebody else had a question.
I think the other person that raised their hand may have left. So if anybody
no.
else has a question, you can, unmute yourself or
Yeah,
raise your
please,
hand.
feel free.
I do want to just thank everyone for coming tonight and joining us. And you'll be able to find the recording on YouTube and on our Facebook channel if you want to watch it again.
And I just want to add, whatever you feel about this issue, and I try to adeptly skip that debate, is, educate yourself about it and, stay on the lookout because you're going to be hearing a lot more about it in the coming years. And one thing I'm trying to work on is kind of helping different communities in New Hampshire remember these events, because the executions didn't just happen in Portsmouth. In fact, they happened all over the state in different parts where a lot of the folklore still exists. And even in Portsmouth today, I mean, we have the Black History Trail, which is fantastic, but there was nothing. There was nothing to tell you about these events that happened. And I'm trying to work to change that, but it's not easy these days. But I appreciate every opportunity I get to kind of spread the awareness and share the history. So thank you.
Do you suspect there might have been more executions than you know?
Possibly, but I've done a pretty thorough searching. I know that any event like that would have been picked up prior to 1739, would have been documented in all the records. New Hampshire is very good colonial records, and would have been documented in newspapers as well, or diaries from the period. And like I said, I found 12 murders in New Hampshire before 1739. Not a single one resulted in execution. Just in my skepticism that there could be others I don't know about is based on when these events did happen, people took notice. People recorded it every time after 1739. And before that, you don't see that. There's no, I mean, it's possible there is one out there we missed, but no other historian has been able to turn it up as far as I know so far. So, but we'll keep digging. Okay.
Well, if nobody has any other questions, I guess we will call it a night. Thank you so much for coming, Chris. And yes, thank you for coming.
Chris.
Thank you.